Good to see everybody. Hi. I thought we would
Hello.
begin today with and I'm going to ask everybody to mute themselves until we'll take pauses, and then I'll invite people if you want to share something, to say something, then you can unmute. But for now, I'm going to ask people to mute themselves because there's a lot of background noise that we're going to be hearing from people if they don't do that.
And if you're calling in, you mute by hitting *6 and unmute by hitting *6.
Okay, thank you. So again, a big thank you to John for making all of this possible. And since we're doing this on a weekly basis, I thought that we would sort of have an opening that would be a kind of a constant opening, like the way they have shows, and they have their theme song, and they have their their intro that's always the same. So I'd like to begin, as we began last week, with this story about stories, and then we'll go into our particular story for today. So this is a story. It's a chassidic story that has been told by many people, and it's at the beginning, for instance, of Elie Wiesel's book, The Gates of the Forest, and it goes like this. When the great Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov saw misfortune threatening the Jewish people, it was his custom go into a certain part of the forest to meditate, and there he would light a fire and say a special prayer, and the miracle would be accomplished and the misfortune would be averted. Later, when his disciple, the celebrated Maggid of Mezrich, had occasion for the same reason to intercede with heaven, he would go to the same place in the forest, and he would say, Ribbono Shel Olam, Master of the universe, listen, I do not know how to light the fire, but I am still able to say the prayer, and again the miracle would be accomplished and the evil situation would be averted. Still later, Rabbi Moshe Lev of Sasov, in order to save the people once more, would go into the forest, and he would say, Ribbono Shel Olam, Master of the universe, I do not know how to light the fire, and I do not know the prayer, but at least I know the place, and this must be sufficient. And it was sufficient, and the miracle was accomplished. And then it fell to Rabbi Israel of Rizhin to try to avert misfortune. But he sat on his armchair, his head in his hands, and he turned to God and he said, Ribbono Shel Olam, Master of the universe, I am unable to light the fire, and I do not know the prayer. I cannot even find the place in the forest. All I can do is tell the story, and this must be sufficient. And it was sufficient. Elie Wiesel adds to this story, God has made human beings because God loves stories. Story I want to share with you today is a little bit of a different type of story than the stories that we looked at in our first session. At that time, we looked at stories from the Torah itself, and then developments of that sacred source of the story about the incense and the plague as it came out in our very, very sacred books of the Zohar. Today, I want to change the type of source that we're going to be looking at. And I want to share with you a story that I came upon recently, just out of the blue from an exchange with a friend. And it was a story I came upon by accident while we were looking at and talking about other things. But I think it's a pretty cool story. And it's a story that was shared in the online magazine, the Jewish magazine Tablet, a couple of years ago in 2018. And the story is told by a rabbi in California, Rabbi Pinney Dunner. And the name of this story is The Amazing Return of the Yabloner Rebbe. So this is almost kind of hot off the story presses, and I'll share it with you as it's presented in the words of Rabbi Dunner. It was a hot, balmy day in June 1975, and the sun beat mercilessly down on the Cal State campus in Northridge, California, as crowds of parents and grandparents, siblings, and friends arrived to celebrate the graduation of their loved ones. May we see our ability to celebrate such graduation gatherings speedily in our time. That's my editorial. Once inside the graduation hall, families eagerly looked for their graduate among the hundreds of graduates who were seated in the front few rows. Proud mothers waved at their sons and daughters and blew them kisses, and the graduates in their caps and gowns sheepishly grinned back. A little old man, shuffling slowly into the hall, did not seem to belong to any family group. Dressed in a black gown and cap, he was actually one of the graduates. At almost 80 years old, he was senior to the second oldest graduate by a margin of many decades. Seemingly oblivious to the noise around him, he slowly made his way forward, nodding almost imperceptibly at the few people who made eye contact. As he reached halfway toward the front of the hall, a man in his mid-30s suddenly stepped into the aisle in front of him. "Hello, uncle!" The old man looked up, his face crinkled into a broad smile, and his sad brown eyes twinkled with pleasure. "Ehud, wow! I really was not expecting you. That is so nice of you. Thank you so much for coming. You know it wasn't necessary." "Don't be ridiculous," Ehud replied. "How could I have missed your graduation?" The old man grinned broadly and shook Ehud's hand. An usher urged him to find his seat, and he slowly walked toward the graduate section, where the nondescript octogenarian was nothing more than a slightly out-of-place curiosity. Those who knew him called him George, or Mr. Nagel. That was his name, George T. Nagel, an elderly Jewish man with a foreign accent who lived in a room in the dorm building and more often than not could be found reading in the library. In the 5 years that he had been at Cal State, although he lived in the dorm building, George had made no real friends among the young students. No one knew exactly how old he was, nor why he was so keen to graduate with a degree in psychology. But, truthfully, nobody cared enough to ask. George Nagel was a loner. Although he was unfailingly polite in his interactions were limited to meal times, and he clearly had no interest in socializing. He was unobtrusive and studious, a phantom who had been living under the name George T. Nagel for over 40 years. His real name was Yechezkel Taub, and he was the scion of one of Poland's most illustrious chassidic dynasties, having inherited his father's title at the age of 24, along with a thriving chassidic court and a sect numbering thousands of loyal followers. In fact, although no one at CSUN at that hot day in 1975 knew it, George T. Nagel was none other than the once acclaimed Yabloner Rebbe, the founder of a unique village called Kfar Chassidim near Haifa, in what is now the state of Israel, to which he led hundreds of his loyal followers from Poland before the Holocaust. What not even Taub realized on the day of his anonymous graduation was that a process had started that would see the Yabloner Rebbe reunited with his past and reconnected with the unique project from which he had desperately tried to escape, but with which he would forever and unavoidably be identified. Yechezkel Taub was born on October 7th, 1895, in Nowy Maestro, Neustadt in Yiddish, a small town in Poland just north of Plonsk, which was where my grandmother came from, north of Warsaw. His father, Rabbi Yaakov Taub, was a Rebbe of the Yabloner, a small rural town close to Warsaw that was the home to a vibrant Orthodox Jewish community. Revered across Poland as a mystical chassidic teacher, Rabbi Yaakov Taub was a great-grandson of the original Yechezkel Taub, after whom he named his newborn son. That grandfather was the illustrious Rebbe of Kuzmir, progenitor of several Hasidic dynasties, most famously the Montclair sect, whose music I love very much, and I love to sing their nigunim all the time. Renowned for their love of music and for their numerous beautiful musical compositions sung at Shabbat and festival gatherings. Rabbi Yaakov's father, Rabbi Yosef Moshe Taub, who died in 1866, had moved to Yablona from Nowy Maestro, from Neustadt, where his father, Reb David Tzvi Hirsch Taub, had founded a branch of the Kuzmir sect. Pious and devout, Rabbi Yosef Moshe was married to a descendant of Rabbi Yisrael Hopstein, the legendary Koznitzer Maggid, and he set up his own branch of the Kuzmir dynasty in Yablona, becoming known as the Yabloner Rebbe. Tragically, he died young, leaving his 6-year-old son Yaakov to be raised by his grandfather. In 1882, Rabbi Yaakov married Bella Gurman, and in the years that followed, they had 5 children, Yechezkel and 4 daughters. Unusually, it was Rabbi Yaakov's son-in-law, Chaim Yosef Halevi Vanchotzer, who married to his oldest daughter, who was groomed to be the successor, rather than his son, Yechezkel. But when Chaim Yosef unexpectedly died at a young age, the burden of expectation suddenly fell upon Yechezkel. Nevertheless, this unpredicted turn of events was not of great concern. At the time of Chaim Yosef's death, Rabbi Yaakov was still in his 50s, and it would surely be many years before Yechezkel would inherit the Rebbe's title and responsibilities. But Rabbi Yaakov was not in good health. Soon after World War I began, he moved from Yablona to Warsaw to be closer to Poland's best medical doctors and facilities. But sadly, it was to no avail. In the summer of 1920, the age of 60, Rabbi Yaakov passed away, and Yechezkel, who was not quite 25 years old and barely prepared for the position, suddenly found himself as the head of one of Poland's prestigious chassidic sects. So we'll take a little break here for a second. If anybody has any comments or questions or remarks about anything so far, just take a little pause here. Okay, here we go. With the help of his wife Pearl, a Koznitz descendant whom he had married in 1915, and with the help of his widowed elder sister Michal Rochtel, Yechezkel threw himself into the task of leading and inspiring his followers, intent on living up to the legacy of his father and the Kuzmir Hasidic heritage. Genuinely concerned for the welfare of his followers, he was very warm and personable, in addition to being learned and highly intelligent. He became involved in every aspect of his followers' lives, making sure that the rich helped the poor, that the less well-off devoted time to community affairs so that they wouldn't feel like takers. The Hasidim adored him and flocked to his weekly Friday night Tish gatherings. A Tish is a table where the Hasidic Rebbe sits and teaches and gives out food, and there are songs where he sang with them and regaled them with Torah discourses. The new Yabloner Rebbe was considered a rising star among the Hasidic Rebbes of Poland and a future leader of Polish Jewry. Here is a picture of him at about that time. But everything changed in 1924 with the visit to Yablona by a distant relative of the young Rebbe, the charismatic Rabbi Yeshaya Shapira, crown prince of the Polish Hasidic world. Rabbi Yeshaya's late father, Rabbi Elimelech Shapira, had been the revered Rebbe of Grodzinsk, whose followers numbered in the tens of thousands and who were spread across Poland. Tragically, Rabbi Elimelech's eldest three sons had predeceased him, and so he remarried when he was in his 60s, and he had two more sons, the first of whom, Rabbi Kalonimus Kalman of Pieczno, would later become immortalized as the Rebbe of the Holocaust-era Warsaw Ghetto, whose inspiring sermons to demoralized ghetto inhabitants were recorded on scraps of paper and were recovered from the rubble of the ghetto after the war and published in a book entitled Eish Kodesh, Sacred Fire. Rabbi Yeshaya Shapira, who was Rabbi Elimelech's youngest child, within a year of his birth, Rabbi Elimelech died. His widow moved back to her parents' home, where the two boys were brought up and educated by another rabbi, Rabbi Chaim Shmuel Horvitz Sternfeld of Chanshin, a descendant of the Chozemi Lublin, the seer of Lublin, one of the most unusual Hasidic Rebbes in Poland. Incredibly studious and with a gifted intellect, he was renowned for completing the entire Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch once a year, and also known for his very ostentatious court. But most of all, he was notorious for his eager support of the proto-Zionist movement Chovevei Tzion, Lovers of Zion, and for advocating settlement in the Holy Land. So I will take just a moment to mention this was very, very unusual. We take Zionism, support of the idea of there being a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel, we take it for granted. But we have to remember that even by the beginning of the 20th century, this was a minority position among the Jewish people. And certainly among the ultra-Orthodox, their idea was we wait for the Messiah, we wait for the Mashiach, and we have no business meddling in politics, we have no business meddling in worldly affairs. And all of these chalutzim, these pioneers who are going to Israel, are just troublemakers, and they didn't want to have anything to do with them. So here and there were Orthodox leaders, traditional Jewish rabbis, and members of that community. Here and there, a few of them disagreed. And it was a very painful position to take. They subjected themselves to a lot of opposition, to a lot of heartache. So here we have a Hasidic Rebbe, no less, and the Hasidic Rebbeim were very much against going to the land of Israel. Here was one who was an exception. It was this aspect of his outlook that would capture the heart of his grandson, Rabbi Yeshaya. Rejecting attempts to get him to lead his own Hasidic sect, Rabbi Yeshaya became consumed by the idea of Jews resettling the land of Israel. In 1914, he visited Ottoman-controlled Palestine, where he was overcome by the headway made by the Zionist pioneers who had settled there. Remember, 1914 was a mere 35 years, less than 35 years, since the first Zionist pioneers had come into the land of Israel. 1881-82 was the beginning of the modern Zionist movement into the land of Israel to try to establish settlements. So by 1914, it was still a very baby fledgling project. Despite his elevated Hasidic pedigree, he became an active member of the Zionist movement, which was then dominated by secular Jews who were openly hostile to religious observance. With the outbreak of World War I, Rabbi Shai was expelled from Palestine by the Turks. Anyone who was not an Ottoman citizen was thrown out of the country. And so he returned to Poland, where he founded the Polish branch of Mizrahi and enthusiastically promoted the immigration of Torah-observant settlers to Palestine. Mizrahi was the religious Zionist movement. In 1920, he managed to return to Palestine with the intention of moving there, even though his wife initially refused to join him. In 1922, he presided over the founding of Hapoel HaMizrahi, an organization devoted to setting up agricultural settlements in Palestine for religious Zionists. His ultimate dream was the relocation of an entire chassidic sect from Poland to a new home in Palestine, together with their Rebbe, so that the stigma attached to Zionist immigration would be offset by the success of a mature chassidic community who had immigrated en masse without any depletion of their Torah observance or chassidic identity. With this in mind, he set out on a mission back to Poland in 1924 and came upon the Yabloner Rebbe and his community. The impact of Rabbi Yeshaya's visit to Yablona was electric. He regaled his hosts with vivid description of the Holy Land, told them about the opportunities available to those who bought land and created agricultural settlements. The Ottoman Turks were gone, and the British were now in control. In 1917, Great Britain's Foreign Secretary Arthur J. Balfour had dispatched a letter to Lord Rothschild in London, a letter later to be called the Balfour Declaration, which firmly declared that the British government viewed, quote, with favor, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Not since the days of Cyrus the Great, the Persian emperor, who had Gentile power and had urged the Jews to return to their homeland, said Rabbi Yeshaya. This is the first time that we have this chance again. The declaration by Cyrus in ancient Persia had resulted in the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, the reestablishment of Jewish supremacy in the Jews' ancient territory. Now, thousands of years later, that same opportunity had arisen once again. How was it possible that religious Jews who had so tenaciously clung to their heritage over millennia would cede this opportunity to those reprobate Jews who had discarded the Torah and Judaism? This was a chance for a religious renewal of biblical proportions, said Rabbi Yeshaya. And what greater way was there to embrace this chance than by moving from Poland as a complete community, old and young, rich and poor, to relocate to the heaven on earth that was the land of Israel. Rabbi Yeshaya's passionate presentation and infectious enthusiasm had a profound effect on the Yabloner Rebbe and on many of his chassidim. The Rebbe immediately called together a gathering of all his followers, and during which he forcefully advocated for the Yabloner sect to immediately begin preparing to move to Palestine. Initially, he suggested the less well-off members of the sect would go together with him and lay the necessary groundwork. The purchase of the land and all the initial expenses would be funded by the wealthier members of the community who would ultimately join the new settlement once everything was set up. The response to this vision, anybody want to guess?
Not good.
The response to this vision in Yablona was jubilant and euphoric. It was as if the Messianic era had arrived. Those who were planning to travel with the Rebbe to Palestine began to prepare for the trip. The Rebbe himself feverishly fundraised among his followers from anyone who had any affiliation with the Kuzmir Chassidic groups. He also sought the blessing of senior Chassidic leaders to boost the concept of large-scale Chassidic immigration to Palestine, to reassure his own followers that they were doing the right thing. But the Yabloner Rebbe encountered unexpected disapproval at a meeting with the esteemed leader of the Ger Chassidic sect, Rabbi Avraham Mordechai Alter, known as the Ger Rebbe. He presided over tens of thousands of Chassidim in Poland We've heard that phrase already a couple of times, and it's something hard to imagine. But before the war, tens and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews were in one chassidic group or another in Poland and in Ukraine and Galicia. And these were major Jewish public leaders. So the Ger Rebbe was an important man. He was widely acknowledged as one of the principal leaders of European Orthodoxy. Although the predominant view among the Hasidic leadership was strongly anti-Zionist, Rabbi Alter was less hostile toward the new realities in Palestine and was even supportive of Orthodox immigration, in marked contrast to many of the Hasidic rabbis of the time, who considered any action by Orthodox Jews which might be interpreted as tacit support of Zionism as catastrophic. But the meeting did not go as planned. After probing the Yabloner on every aspect of the proposed project, the Ger Rebbe dismissed it as a terrible idea. Quote, "Don't take any money or any help from the secular Zionists," he warned ominously. "They do not have your interests at heart. Any financial dependence on them will be an utter disaster." Surprised by the harsh advice, the Yabloner Rebbe was still determined to carry out his plans. Within months, he was on a boat to Haifa with a couple of hundred Yabloner Hasidim, armed with cash from hundreds more, who wanted to own some holy land and to participate in this unique endeavor. Traveling with him on the boat was Rabbi Yisrael Eliezer Hopstein, who was en route to Palestine with a group of Kosher followers. The two rabbis decided to join forces and build a Hasidic settlement together. They arrived in Palestine, where they were feted by Zionist officials. Although they were offered land near Tel Aviv, the Yabloner Rebbe preferred the mountains overlooking the Jezreel Valley close to Haifa. And he asked the Jewish Agency and the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, to help him purchase land in that area. The principal landowners in the Jezreel Valley were the Sursuks of Beirut, one of the most prominent Christian families in Lebanon. At one time, they had planned to build a railway line across the valley, and the legendary British diplomat and Christian philo-Semite Sir Lawrence Oliphant had worked hard to find investors to fund the construction, but the plans never were realized. The land had been in the Sursuk family for generations, tenanted by Arab farmers who paid for the right to work the land. But they had no legal rights to the land, and the British authorities confirmed that the Sursuks could sell the land to the JNF without giving notice to Arab residents, who could summarily be evicted without compensation. With the help of JNF and the legendary Zionist land purchaser Yoshua Hankin, several thousand acres were purchasing, encompassing the Arab villages of Sheikh Abrek, El Harbaj, El Harshich. The Arab residents were given compensation to vacate the land. So even though the British determination was that they could just be kicked off, the effort was to give them something in return. Two Hasidic groups began building homes on a hill overlooking the Jezreel Valley and the Kishon River. The Yabloner Rebbe had decided to call his section of the village Nachlas Yaakov, after his late father, while the Koshnitz neighborhood was called Avodas Yisrael, a reference to the founder of the Koshnitz dynasty. The Rebbe reached a financial arrangement with the JNF, who agreed to treat the down payment for the land as a loan to be repaid to the 90 families after 2 years, once the settlement was up and running, and on condition that the families remained. The deposit amounted to a quarter of all the money the group had brought with them from Poland, but both JNF and the Rebbe were confident that sufficient funds remained to set up the settlement, which they agreed would be a dairy farm. High-profile visitors flocked to the new settlement to see the remarkable phenomenon of Hasidic Zionist farmers, all for themselves. Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Cook, the Ashkenazic chief rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov Meir, the Sephardic chief rabbi, all came with other rabbis, with the Zionist philosopher Achad Ha'am, and also other writers like Chaim Nachman Bialik. The future president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, visited, and Lord Balfour with him. The 1917 declaration of Lord Balfour being, of course, one of the impetuses for this. Weizmann, in his role as head of the Jewish Agency, had been particularly critical of Polish immigrants who refused to work the land, and particularly the Orthodox, who set themselves up in new urban enclaves such as Bnei Brak, one of the places where the virus is rampant. His visit to the Yabloner Rebbe's village and farm was deliberately promoted and widely publicized to highlight the chassidic pioneers' dedication to the Zionist ideal. Not everyone was happy with the attention that the Yabloner Rebbe was getting. The secular Zionist movement had been running intensive training programs for pioneer settlers for years, and they were horrified that the Zionist leadership was tripping over itself to accommodate untrained and, in their eyes, untrainable Hasidic immigrants. David Ben-Gurion, who headed the powerful Histadrut trade union umbrella organization, scathingly attacked those who were promoting this Hasidic farming community. Quote, "How dare these Hasidim from Yablona and Kozhnitz be allowed to immigrate to Eretz Yisrael and waste precious land? If they must come, let them settle in Tel Aviv and leave the real work to people who know what they're doing." Ben-Gurion had a point. The 90 families who had joined the Rebbe in Palestine were comprised of all ages, including elderly grandparents, nursing mothers, little children, and none of the adult men had any training in construction or dairy farming. Rose-tinted idealism would only carry them so far. Ultimately, the community would need to become self-supporting if it was to become the beacon of Orthodox agricultural immigration. Conscious of animosity that the project was generating, in 1926, the JNF published a gushing pamphlet, Chassidim alu el haaretz, the Chassidim have come up to the land. The short pamphlet described the ethereal atmosphere of spending Shabbat in the pioneer Chassidic village, singing, dancing, spirituality, all in the setting of a utopian agrarian community devoted to turning the barren landscape of the Holy Land into a land flowing with milk and honey. The Yabloner Rebbe featured prominently in the pamphlet and was described as the engine of the enterprise, working from early morning to late at night, focused on the minutest details, available for every single one of his followers, young and old, as they struggled to turn the dream into reality. Tragically, however, whatever could have gone wrong, went wrong. The former Arab tenant farmers refused to leave their land and villages, despite the compensation they received. There was heavy rain and the Kishon River overflowed, flooding the valley and turning it into an unmanageable swamp. The Hasidim made a vain attempt to drain the swamp, to no avail. Soon the water-sodden land was infested with mosquitoes, and malaria broke out among the settlers, and some of them succumbed to the sickness and died. The bridge they built over the Kishon was wrecked by Bedouin who were camping locally. The heavy rain continued, the swamp grew. Meanwhile, the Arabs killed one of the cows and threw it into the well, contaminating the fresh water supply. Venomous snakes hidden among the ubiquitous thorns bit farm workers, killing more than one. Bedouin marauders murdered some of the newcomers. Money was scarce. The dairy farm seemed unable to make ends meet. Despite the initial enthusiastic moral and financial support from Yabloner Hasidim in Poland that continued after they arrived, funding from abroad slowly dwindled and then dried up completely. The Hasidim were literally starving. In 1928, the Rebbe went to the United States, where he visited various communities to raise money. Although he was warmly welcomed wherever he went, he had very limited success in finding support, and he returned empty-handed. In desperation, the Yabloner Rebbe turned to the Zionist organizations for help, but soon he discovered that they were going through their own challenges. Palestine was experiencing a serious recession. Financial support from Zionist philanthropists in Europe and the US had decreased. Nevertheless, the Rebbe was unrelenting. It would not let the mounting challenges destroy his dream. "We don't have any money. We're drowning in difficulties," the Rebbe told the Zionist officials. "But we have come this far and we are not going back. We are not giving up now." The JNF and the Jewish Agency sat there and were stony-faced. This enterprise was no longer the propaganda vehicle of 1925. They were in no mood to waste time or money. But the Yabloner Rebbe had a plan up his sleeve. He would arrange for a skilled group of Hapoel HaMizrahi, religious Zionist farm workers, to be brought in, he told them, train and work alongside the Polish chassidim. Each of the new farm workers would be given their own plot of land to build a home free of charge, in addition to some land that they could farm. The mountaintop village would move down into the valley, which would give farmers easier access to the farms. And the Rebbe would trade excess land with the JNF and the Jewish Agency for food and other supplies. We may not have any money to give you, he told them, but we have plenty of land, far more than we need to make our community successful. We can give JNF land in exchange for whatever is needed. And then he added, please, do not abandon us to our fate. My chassidim are dying, and I need to save them. Ultimately, they reached an agreement. The Zionist administrators insisted that the elderly and infirm would have to return to Poland until everything was sorted out, as they were a drain on the resources. Secondly, the dairy farm would need to close and make room for orchards and crops. Thirdly, the land would all be signed over to the JNF pending future developments. The Rebbe agreed to all these conditions. In exchange, the Jewish Agency provided the settlers with a stipend while JNF took care of accumulated debts. The two branches of the chassidic groups were combined into a single entity called Kfar Hasidim, Village of Hasidim. And they were joined also by a third group, religious Zionists from Germany and Holland, from Western Europe, who had trained in the Hachshara camps in Europe. That's the training camps in Europe to prepare people to come to the land of Israel and be farmers. And they would change the farming community's fortunes for the better. In May 1930, work was finished on a paved road connecting Kfar Hasidim to Haifa. Rebbe immediately arranged for those Hasidim who were not working on the farms and other necessities, and added that the project was up, I think I skipped a page, to obtain jobs in Haifa. And the commuter bus was organized to pick them up and drop them off the same day, a remarkable innovation of the time. Sadly, although matters had improved for residents of Kfar Hasidim, the Yabloner Rebbe soon found himself in the midst of a financial scandal. With the situation for Jews in Poland rapidly deteriorating, especially after 1935, Hasidim from Yabloner began turning up in Palestine, expecting to take possession of the plots of land that they had paid for over a decade earlier. But the Yabloner Rebbe was unable to give them any land. He had given it all back to the JNF in exchange for their support, and they accused him of being a thief. He begged them to understand, but in their eyes, the Rebbe was a crook who had fraudulently taken their money and not given them what he promised in return. After the outbreak of the Arab Revolt in 1936, increasing violence against Jews in Palestine, longtime residents of Kfar Hasidim also demanded money from the Rebbe so they could go back to Poland. But he had no money for them either. Kfar Hasidim was just beginning to pay for itself, and there was no money to spare. With outstanding debts to the JNF and the Jewish Agency, and the threat that they would repossess land and the homes of Kfar Hasidim, and at the same time battling accusations of theft from his own followers, the Yabloner Rebbe traveled to the United States in 1938 to see if he could interest some wealthy Zionists to give him financial support. He would not return to Kfar Hasidim for over 40 years. The Rebbe arrived in New York and moved in with his niece, Arla Mezrich, daughter of his sister, who had tragically died in 1931 after being bitten by a snake. Arla was raised in Kfar Hasidim, but some years earlier had decided to leave for the United States. He arrived in 1935 and married. The family had a bag manufacturing business based on the East Coast, were moderately prosperous. Yabloner Rebbe used the Mezrich house as his base, began visiting Orthodox communities sympathetic to the Zionist cause to generate support for the expansion of Kfar Hasidim. To broaden his appeal, he partnered with the Federation of Polish Jews in America. an organization founded in 1908 to aid Polish Jews who had settled there, but which had more recently begun to give relief for Polish Jews in distress. By the late 1930s, anti-Semitism in Poland had reached a new peak, fully enabled by the Polish government, and this situation motivated the Federation to offer their full support for the Rebbe's plans to bring Polish Jews out of Poland and to Palestine. In July 1939, the New York Daily News reported the purchase of 400 acres in Palestine by the Federation for the settlement of 500 Jewish families from Poland. The report declared that colonists would move to Palestine from Poland and would be extended credit for building houses and other necessities. Tragically, the ambitious plans never had the chance to materialize. 2 months later, the German army marched into Poland, and the Yabloner Rebbe now found himself stuck in the United States as a war refugee. He immediately abandoned his fundraising campaign and attempted to volunteer for the war effort. At first, he attempted to join the army and the navy, but they were not particularly interested in the idea of conscripting a Polish chassidic Jew in his mid-40s. Undaunted by this rejection, the Rebbe began to look for construction work in the military supplies industry that was quickly gathering pace during the early months of the war. As the war in Europe escalated, the Yabloner Rebbe moved out west, where he found work in the California shipyards. In 1942, the Jewish Floridian reported that the Rebbe was working as a riveter at a shipyard in San Francisco. A few months later, the same newspaper reported that he had moved to Los Angeles, where he had found work as a designing engineer in another shipyard. Quote, "The Rebbe solves the problem of observing the Sabbath without losing hours by working overtime on weekdays." In June 1942, the BBC broadcast a report claiming that over 700,000 Polish Jews had been deliberately and systematically exterminated by the Nazis. By November, American newspapers had confirmed the slaughter, but revealed that the BBC had underestimated the true magnitude of the genocide. Millions of European Jews had been murdered by the Nazis, they reported, and the grisly rumors that had been emerging from the European continent for over a year were all true. Jewish communities in allied countries across the world held rallies, prayer days, and vigils. And Wednesday, December 2nd, 1942, was declared an International Day of Mourning. Jews who had family in the Nazi-controlled countries or in countries with ties to Nazi Germany were panic-stricken. And across the world, they desperately lobbied the Allied leadership to do something, anything, that would bring the relentless killing to a halt. But besides empty declarations and meaningless platitudes, nothing was done, and the slaughter continued. For the Yabloner Rebbe, erstwhile rabbi of Yablona near Warsaw, the emerging news of the Holocaust came as a double blow. Besides the fact that the entire Yablona community had been obliterated, along with the rest of Polish Jewry, there were those, including the extended families of many of the Kfar Hasidim pioneers, whom he had sent back from Palestine to Poland because they served no useful purpose in the farming settlement and were a pointless drain on its resources. This had been a non-negotiable condition for the continued involvement of the JNF and the Jewish Agency with the Hasidic settlement, and however reluctant the Rebbe may have been in going along with it, he had allowed it to happen. In his own mind, the Rebbe began to believe that the deaths of those who had gone back to Poland were his fault. The pain was overwhelming, and moreover, where was God in all this? Did he even exist? If he did, was it not crystal clear that he had utterly abandoned the Yabloner Rebbe? So many people's lives had been lost or devastated, and he, Yechezkel Taub, had been the agent of their destruction. His entire Hasidic sect had been wiped out, and those who remained alive in Kfar Hasidim despised him for his role in wrecking their lives. In late 1944, as the full weight of his distressing predicament became clear and his anger at God grew and kept on growing, Yabloner Rebbe decided on a drastic course of action. Without chassidim, he decided to himself, he was no longer a Rebbe. A Rebbe has to have chassidim, and his chassidim were gone. Meanwhile, his Kfar Chassidim project in Palestine was an utter failure. Whoever remained there certainly didn't need him, and it was more than likely they didn't want him there. The best thing for him to do would be to disappear into oblivion in the United States of America, like millions of other faceless immigrants who had done the same. And just like that, one day, Rabbi Yechezkel Taub, the revered Yabloner Rebbe, at one time leader of thousands of devoted followers, trailblazing Orthodox Zionist settler, removed his yarmulke, cut off his payas, shaved off his beard, and quietly changed his name and filed immigration papers to become a naturalized citizen of the United States. On August 1st, 1945, two non-Jewish acquaintances, Margaret Depew, a hotel manageress, and Albert Krapo, a rigger, both vouched that they had known Chazkiel Taub since December 1944 as a man of good moral character, and then witnessed him take the oath of allegiance, after which he was confirmed as a U.S. citizen, and his naturalization papers referred to him as George Ezekiel Taub Nagel. He avoided all contact with the Jewish community of Los Angeles, severed all contact with Kfar Hasidim, except for secretive communications with his own family, who referred to him by the code name Uncle Dode. He stopped keeping kosher, stopped observing the Shabbat and festivals, including Yom Kippur. He abandoned the study of the Torah or any religious texts, almost never visited a synagogue. For all intents and purposes, the Yabloner Rebbe was no more, replaced by an urbane Polish immigrant with slick back hair and a sad, faraway look in his eyes. With World War II over, the shipyard no longer needed George Nagel, but his many years working in construction and engineering would not go to waste. Though he began, I'm going to shorten a little bit the rest of this story. Every detail, though, is truly fascinating. He became a developer of affordable housing in Southern California. He borrowed money to buy plots of land on which he constructed the type of modest homes that were becoming ubiquitous across the valley. Occasionally, he would partner on a project with one or more of the enterprising group of Orthodox Jewish Holocaust survivors who had landed in Fairfax, but he never told them who he was. This is a picture of the Yabloner Rebbe during this period.
Can you hold it up higher and farther away? We can't quite see it. There you go.
Please hold it
There was-
higher.
Like
Good.
that? Okay?
Good.
Thank
Good.
you. Okay. One of George's friends in the strictly Orthodox community was Yidel Rottenberg, son of the Kosonya Rebbe, and Reb Moshe Shmuel Rottenberg, who had immigrated in the early 1930s and arrived in Los Angeles in 1937. Yidel was a shochet, a ritual slaughterer, charming conversationalist, and they had a small chassidic synagogue in Fairfax, Los Angeles. He encouraged George to join him there, and on rare occasions, George relented and came to shul, but only on the condition that no one be told who he really was. When the Sadiger Premeshlu Rebbe visited Los Angeles in the 1950s, he presided over a gathering of local Los Angeles Hasidim one Saturday night. Yidel Rottenberg persuaded George to attend. At the time, Rabbi Friedman was one of the foremost Hasidic rabbinic personalities in the world. There was quite a crowd at the synagogue, but not like it used to be, and not like it would have been in New York or in the bigger centers. You call this a tish? One of the attendees said to their friend within earshot of George and Yidel. This is a joke, a shadow of what a real tish should look like. I remember the tish of the Yabloner Rebbe. My father took me to one when I was a child. That was a real tish, with proper singing, a real spiritual atmosphere, not like this. He got up and he left. So here is George, the former Yabloner Rebbe, hearing about the glory days that this man remembered from when he was a child. The California economy took a nosedive in the late 60s. Unemployment began to climb. Bank deregulation had changed the dynamics for savings and loans. In short, George goes bankrupt. And then he got sick. As he lay sick in hospital, George was regularly visited by his great nephew, Ehud Yonai. Ehud was the grandson of his older sister, Michal Rachel, whose daughter Erela had married Ehud's father, Mordechai, the rebellious son of an ultra-Orthodox Russian Jewish pioneer who had joined the Kfar Hasidim settlement soon after it was founded. The very secular Mordechai was considered scandalous by the devout Hasidim of Kfar Hasidim, and his son Ehud, who was also not observant, had moved to California after his army service to become a journalist. It was in California that Ehud met his great uncle for the first time, and they became very close. When Ehud heard that George was in the hospital, he rushed to see him, and as the weeks went by, Ehud came regularly to spend time with George to cheer him up. "Why don't you come back to Israel?" he asked George. "What are you still doing in America by yourself with no family?" "I can't go back," George replied. "I messed up their lives. They all think I stole their money. There's no way I could ever go back. Forget it. That part of my life is done. How about you just come back for a visit?" "I'll think about it," said George. And Ehud kept on going with this and would never let up. "So what are you going to do if you get better and get out of the hospital?" "I'm not getting better so fast, and maybe I'll never get out except in a box." "Don't be so morbid. Don't be so silly. What if you get better? You go back to business?" "Never," said George. "Then what?" "I think I want to go to college and study psychology." "Are you kidding? College? Psychology? Why don't you just come home to Israel?" George sighed. "All my life I've been interested in studying psychology. I've just got enough money to live, to scrape by. If I don't die in the hospital, I'm going to apply to university and study psychology. That's what I want to do." And that's what he did. He got out of the hospital eventually, thank God. He applied to college and was accepted. He was in his element as if he was reborn. His sole interest was learning, and he spent most of his time in the library, reading, writing, researching. He still retained a few investment properties through which he was able to modestly support himself, but he refused to get involved in any business at all ever again. He realized that every day he had left was precious. He wasn't going to waste it, any of that remaining time trying to make money, which he realized he didn't need and would never use. Before long, he became a minor celebrity at the college, which in 1972 was renamed California State University Northridge. Newspapers reported on the veteran student dorming alongside anti-war protesting students, many of whom adopted him as a surrogate grandfather. Here is George on his graduation day. He had come full circle. Suddenly he's back in his role as chassidic Rebbe because he was giving all of this support and counseling to these younger college students. He was helping people improve their lives by healing them, by teaching them, by bringing the best out of them. In this guise, he was no longer George Nagel, the immigrant businessman escaping from his miserable past. Instead, he was the Yabloner Rebbe, giving people with no hope a better vision of the future. In 1978, he was ready to return to Kfar Hasidim. He told Ehud that he had booked a round-trip ticket to Israel and the dates. Quietly, without letting George know, Ehud informed his mother that her uncle was coming back. The day arrived, and George landed at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. A car was waiting to pick him up for the 1.5-hour ride to Kfar Hasidim. The car drove through the entrance of the village, stopped at the nondescript house on Rehov HaMiyazdim, that means Founders Street, where George's niece Arela lived with her husband Mordechai. He hadn't seen her in 40 years. Arela ran over to George and hugged him. "Welcome home, uncle," she bubbled. "We have a surprise for you." "A surprise?" He wasn't sure if he liked the idea of a surprise. "Yes," she replied, "but we need to drive up the road to the social hall. There are a few people there who are waiting for you." They arrived at the hall, which was packed with hundreds of people who had gathered to meet the man who had put Kfar Hasidim on the map. Old and young, religious and secular, everyone connected to the village was there. A seat at the front was left empty for George, and a hush descended as he slowly made his way toward his seat and sat down. An elderly man stood up, looked toward George. "Rebbe, do you remember me?" he asked. George looked at him, trying to figure out who he was. "I'm not sure. Are you Chaimke Geldfarb?" Chaimke smiled. "Yes, Rebbe. It's me." His voice was hoarse with emotion. "On behalf of all the residents of our kfar, I want to welcome you back home. You were probably nervous to come here. You probably think we are angry with you. You probably think that because you brought us here from Poland, away from our homes, away from our families, to build your dream, not ours, and then it all went wrong. So you think we're angry that it all went wrong. But Rebbe, if that's what you think, you're mistaken. Because Rebbe, you saved our lives. If it were not for you, we would have all been killed by the Nazis. Look over here." Chaimke pointed to a group of people in the middle of the hall. "That's my son with his wife and children, and next to him my two daughters with their husbands and children. My parents, uncles, aunts, brothers, sisters, and their children, all murdered by the Nazis. But we came with you, Rebbe. We built this place. We founded this village. We survived. And you were the one who saved our lives. And for that we thank you. Thank you for our lives and for the lives of our children and our grandchildren. We can never thank you enough." Chaimke sat down, and an old woman rose to speak. "Rebbe, do you remember me?" George looked carefully at her. "Shendel, is that you?" "Shendel, yes. But now they call me Shoshana." Shendel had a lump in her throat as she spoke, and she struggled to get the words out. Rebbe, where have you been for so many years? We missed you. We needed you. Without you, we would all be dead, and we would not have our beautiful lives and our beautiful Israel. Why did you leave? Everything turned out okay in the end. Look at us. Look at how lucky we are. We escaped from the murderers and built our own homes in God's promised land. You said we could do it, and we did it." Shendel began weeping. Tears flowed down her cheeks as her daughter next to her put an arm around her shoulder. "Rebbe, come home. You've been gone for far too long. It's time to come home." There was dead silence beside Shendel's muffled sobs. George looked around the hall. Everyone was looking at him. He looked down at his hands and then at the floor, and slowly he got to his feet. "My friends, my dear, dear friends, I am so moved by this warm welcome, I don't have very much to say. I have missed this place and all of you so much for all these years. I never understood how much this place meant to me and how much I meant to you until now. I never thought about what you just said. I never thought about the fact that I saved your lives, but only about all the lives that were lost. I never thought about what I gave you, only about what I took away from you. But now it's all become clear." He paused for a few seconds. "You could have heard a pin drop. And then he whispered slowly, "It's time. I'm ready. I'm coming home. I'm ready. I'm coming home." There was a moment of silence, and suddenly the hall erupted in applause. Everyone rose to their feet and applauded, and it went on and on as George made his way through the hall and shook everyone's hand. The Yabloner Rebbe had returned to Kfar Hasidim, and now he was going to move back. He flew back to Los Angeles to wrap up his affairs and prepare for the move to Israel. But sorting everything out took longer than expected. He had wanted to finish a master's degree at California State, but he realized that that was not going to happen. Over the next couple of years, he visited Israel for extended periods until November 1981. He gave away his last few possessions and flew off to Israel to settle there for good. He had just turned 86. After more than 40 years away, he was finally moving back to Kfar Hasidim, loved and valued. It was at this point that George Nagel returned to his roots. He changed his name back to Yechezkel Taub, and he became the Yabloner Rebbe once more. He grew back his beard and his side locks. His yarmulke came back, and so did his religious observance. The Rebbe was given a seat at the front of the synagogue, where he prayed regularly. And several times a week, groups of eager youngsters would gather on the patch of land outside the house in which he lived, and he taught them Torah, and he taught them stories of their heritage in the chassidic tradition. This is the Rebbe's headstone inscription that was installed within a month after he passed away in 1986. He was in Israel for the last 5 years of his life. Here lies Grand Rabbi Yechezkel Taub, the Rebbe of Yablona, son of Grand Rabbi Yaakov Taub, last scion of the dynasty that began with the Grand Rabbi Yechezkel of Kuzmir, disciple of the seer of Lublin. In 5685, that's 1925, he led his chassidim to Eretz Yisrael, where he redeemed the lands of Harbaj, Churkia, and Sheikh Abrech, the founder of Nachlas Yaakov, later known as Kfar Hasidim. So that's the story of the Yabloner Rebbe. We went over a little bit. Maybe we have just a minute or two that I would pose, these questions. What's the relationship between community and faith? We struggle today with these kinds of sessions. We're doing everything that we can to maintain our sense of connection, or maintain our sense of community. And God knows we're struggling with all kinds of difficult situations in the world. And here is a story of a man of great faith, of great energy and determination, who loses his faith. And then at the end of his life, he regains his faith. What is the connection between faith and community? That's something for us, I think, to ponder, and maybe we'll be able to give a little bit of time to talk about that, if you wish, next week. Next week, Wednesday, is Erev Yontif. It's the day that the Pesach begins that evening. Do people want to have a session at 2 o'clock? Do you think you're going to be running around like crazy getting ready for Pesach? There's a very little circle that you can run around in, What do people think about that? Do you want to have a session next week?
I would.
I would.
Okay, so next week let's meet, and this story hopefully will still be a little bit fresh in our memory.
Yeah, I would like to come to a session next week.
Okay, very good. Okay, it's confirmed. So we will meet next week. The beginning of the session, we'll try to have some time to talk about this story that we just heard and that I read to you. And then we'll have a story that hopefully will lead into the Passover holiday. Thank you.
Rabbi, is there a link for that story? can do the
Yeah,
live.
I'll send it to you.
I'm just not sure how we'll put it up for everybody.
It's a tablet. It's if you Google Yabloner Rebbe, Yabloner, you'll get the tablet article.
What I'll do is I'll put a link to the article in the YouTube post when I put this recording on our YouTube page.
Very good. I'll send you the link right away.
All right.
Okay, going off.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you